Good morning, everyone. My name's Tom Kalil. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Schmidt Futures, and we've got an exciting panel today on market shaping and the future of geothermal. And we have three fantastic all-star panelists, and I'm going to introduce them now. We have Rachel Glennerster, who's an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, who will be talking about what is market shaping. Michelle Chang, who is a program manager with Google on energy and carbon technologies, and Jeremy Harrell, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at ClearPath, which is a firm based in DC that's doing some very important policy work on clean energy technologies and innovation. So we're going to start things with Rachel, who is leading an accelerator at the University of Chicago on market shaping. So Rachel, why don't you start off by saying for folks, what is market shaping?
Great, thanks, Tom. Great to be here. So market shaping leverages the power of the private sector and market incentives to deliver innovations or products that society needs. And it recognizes, though, that the private sector and markets might not have all the right incentives without some shaping to deliver those products. In particular, there's a divergence between the value of innovation to society and the returns that an innovator might get, and therefore the need to shape the market to kind of boost the incentives to deliver the products that we need.
Some examples of this.
Yeah, so a good example is an advanced market commitment for the pneumococcal vaccine, which was where a bunch of donors committed to buy a large quantity, excuse me, of a pneumococcal vaccine that was appropriate for low and middle income countries if someone came up with it. And indeed, we had two and eventually three forms of the pneumococcal vaccine that was appropriate for low and middle income countries and large purchases. And this is an illustration of how market shaping can not just deliver innovation like a new vaccine, but it also managed to, by committing to buy a large quantity of it, got that vaccine out to people at large scale much more rapidly than most vaccines reach low and middle income countries. But another example would just be, in the climate side, like cap and trade markets are an example of market shaping, because they end up putting a price on carbon and people make their decisions about what to invest in and how to run their factories based on having to pay for carbon. So that's another example of a market shaping approach.
In the vaccine case, the market failure was left to their own devices. Drug companies will not typically work on vaccines for diseases of the poor because they have no money. So if you're the CFO of a pharma company and you're trying to decide where to invest, you're more likely to invest in vaccines for diseases that are prevalent in rich countries than you are in poor countries.
Yeah, and it's not just that people don't have money, it's also that you have a monopoly buyer who might drive down the price once you've invented it. And normally we protect innovations with patents, which gives a great incentive to innovate, but then the price is high and very few people get to access it, which is terribly inefficient. So, there's lots of arguments about the problems that patents cause, but they also bring benefits. And actually, you can have the best of both worlds if you're willing to pay an innovator a kind of lump sum for their innovation in return for producing at very large scale. Then you both get the return and access. So as they say, there's lots of arguments. Are patents good or bad? Well, actually, we can get the best of both worlds.
Got it. And so if you were talking to an expert in a particular sector like geothermal, what are the types of questions that you typically ask them to find out, A, whether market shaping would be appropriate for this particular sector and this particular challenge that you're trying to solve, and B, how you might use market shaping?
Right. So the first thing that I would ask that you have to know is, is there a gap between the social return and what the private sector is going to make? So anything to do with climate is something which, we know that society benefits a lot more than a company will get returns in the market because, we don't actually mainly have a cost on carbon. So that's the first thing. Another question I would ask is, are there lots of different possible ways of reaching the goal? So lots of different ways of doing geothermal. And if there are, and maybe lots of different companies who might be able to work on this problem, if there are, then you as a funder might not want to pick winners and pick a specific company or put all your bets on one particular technology. You want to be agnostic to that. You want to say, whoever comes up with the best thing, I will buy it.
Right.
So that's, if there's only one person doing it, you can just give them your money. But if there's a range of ideas, then I think market shaping is a good thing. You also have to be able to define success, though. To use market shaping, you need to be able to say, I will reward you if you do this thing, if you get this outcome. Again, I think that's relatively straightforward in geothermal. I'm not an expert, but my first hunch would be you could define what success looked like in advance. And another thing that I would ask is, are the financial markets working? Not perfectly, they never work perfectly, but at least are they functioning? Is it possible for people who have a good idea to be able to raise capital? Because in market shaping, in markets in general, you get rewarded when you have the final product. And so you need, and this is true in pharmaceutical world, if people have good ideas, there are lots of kind of venture capitalists who will help fund you get there to the end if you have a market. And there's different ways that you can shape markets if you think financial markets are there's also problems in those.
Fantastic. That's very helpful. So, Michelle, you have a very important perspective as a buyer of clean energy working for Google. So, as a company that has set a really ambitious goal of using carbon-free energy 24/7, why is geothermal energy important to you?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks for this opportunity to be on this panel. So maybe just as a refresher, Google's 24/7 carbon-free energy goal essentially is a goal that we've set to operate around the clock and around the world on carbon-free energy, matched not only hourly, so for every megawatt hour of load that we have, we find a commensurate megawatt hour of load in that hour, but also matched geographically. And so this makes it a lot more challenging, right? It means that we can't necessarily just buy, a lot of wind and solar PPAs in Texas and offset our load in Singapore. It means that we're going to need to find technologies and carbon-free electricity in Singapore, in region, that are able to generate around the clock 24/7, 365 days a year. And when you think about Google's load, for the most part, data center load is relatively flat. Our footprint spans, the entire globe, and our load is growing. And so when we looked at, where our load trajectory was headed and what technologies were available today, we quickly realized that wind and solar and lithium ion can't get us there alone. It would require vast amounts of overbuild. In a lot of regions, there's, constrained land availability, resource potential constraints. And so we knew immediately we would need to look at new technologies, and that this would really require a portfolio approach that looked at wind and solar and lithium ion, as well as advanced clean electricity technologies like geothermal. So actually, a couple of weeks ago, we released a white paper that covers our sort of thinking about the role that these new technologies will need to play. But maybe diving into geothermal just for a second, Geothermal obviously can provide that firm, clean power around the clock. And really, when we look at our sort of internal profile, we run a CFE optimization model that essentially builds for us. You can think of it like a mini IRP, right? And it shows us the different technologies that will have to play critical roles in different regions. So, for example, in some regions where we operate, geothermal is going to be the star of the show, and we're going to want to procure lots and lots of it because it is the technology that will enable us to get there at the lowest cost and reach the highest levels of CFE. In some other regions, maybe that looks different. Maybe storage is the solution that we're talking about there. And maybe in another region, hydrogen is sort of in combination with a couple of other technologies is really the answer. And so what we've really come to quickly realize is that all technologies are really important, and it's really critical to take this portfolio approach. And when we do take this approach that layers in, all these different technologies, it pulls in advanced nuclear, it pulls in, long duration energy storage, it pulls in wind and solar and geothermal. We've found that reaching sort of these high levels of 24/7 CFE with the inclusion of these new technologies reduces overall costs by approximately 40%. So while these technologies, yeah.
So Google has a history of not only engaging in offtake agreements with individual companies, like the Google Fervo collaboration, for example, but also in being involved in industry-wide efforts like Frontier Climate on permanent carbon removal, which includes not only Alphabet, but Stripe and Meta and Shopify and McKinsey. And I believe that you were one of the founders of the Clean Energy Buyers Association. So have you thought about what sort of a multilateral effort in the private sector might look like for geothermal?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept, Tom. I think one of the main sort of pieces of value that corporates can drive here, I think, is really in demand signaling, right? And the way that we think about it, obviously it is not just for geothermal, but for all advanced clean electricity technologies. So like Rachel said, we really strongly believe in a technology agnostic approach and in not picking winners here. And so, one of the things that we hear sort of number one when we're out in the market talking to a lot of these developers is it's really challenging to get these technologies over the valley of death of the first of a kind commercial plant. It's really hard for a variety of reasons to get these projects built. And offtake can't solve 100% of those, but they can bridge a significant portion, right? In offering a bankable offtake contract to allow these projects to get financed. But when it comes to, signing that offtake, going it alone, sort of as a single offtaker, despite Google's size, sometimes we can't underwrite an entire project all by ourselves. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense to, from sort of a risk perspective and a portfolio diversification perspective. And I think like even moving beyond first of a kind, we don't want just one-offs of these projects. We want to see multiple of these projects getting developed so that the technology is able to come down that cost curve. And to do that requires an even larger demand signal, right? Beyond just that first project. But a lot of these technologies fall victim to this sort of mentality of the market wanting to wait and see how that first of a kind project performs before they come in on that second or third of a kind project. And so the way we think about it is, demand aggregation is a really interesting way at solving some of these problems and sending as large of a signal as possible so that we can underwrite not only multiple technologies, right? So not just one or two small pilots here and there, but a whole range. And not only just, that first of a kind project for those different technologies, but also the second and the third and the fourth, so that we're able to get those economies of scale. We're able to send the market some level of confidence, this signal that there is demand beyond just the first project. And we've seen this work really well, to your point, in the Frontier Climate coalition that we've joined last year alongside, Stripe and Shopify and Meta and McKinsey. This was a commitment to buy $1 billion of carbon removals by 2030. And we've been really excited by the progress that we've seen this, initiative have. We've, underwritten our first offtake contract. We've really, seen how this instrument has really catalyzed the market to focus on delivery of actual projects and delivery of tons of carbon removed. And speaking from a corporate perspective, that's important for our corporate goals, but it's also important because, it's not just sending a headline demand signal, but it's actually following through by executing and facilitating these actual bankable offtake contracts. And so, I think you're absolutely right. This AMC model could hold a lot of promise, I think, for advanced clean electricity technologies like geothermal.
Fantastic. So, Jeremy, given that one of the technologies that ClearPath has been working on is geothermal, do you have a view about what sort of these demand pull or market shaping initiatives would have the biggest impact on addressing the sort of valley of death issues that Michelle was talking about?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's important to look at this lens on where geothermal has an advantage. As you mentioned, ClearPath, a DC-based advocacy firm, focuses across the clean energy and clean tech spectrum, right? And so we're looking for policies that foster technological innovation, allow them to get scaled up. So I also work on nuclear and gas with carbon capture, things along those lines. One of the things that geothermal has a big advantage on is one, like it's commercially deployed technology already, widespread in the West. And two, nuclear, heavier, high CapEx projects, fusion, for example, could meet the 24/7 requirement as well. We're not quite there yet on commercial development. CCUS really strongly supports CCUS. There's other dynamics, both it's still a fossil-based technology and you have to deal with CO2. And so there's some really key things that can be kind of unlocked for geothermal in particular. I think permitting reform in particular that drives down the cost of the initial deployment of these type of things are really, really important. I think market mechanisms that value 24/7. So if we're talking about electricity sector as a whole, measures that are going in place that value the 24/7 dynamic, as Michelle was very laying out there. These dynamics are way more important than just the low cost marginal asset that you deploy on the ground. And so in some markets, that's valuing capacity markets or valuing the 24/7 dynamics. In the state of California, for example, the PUC straight up just asked for bids for geothermal because geothermal is the one technology they could see that was out there that would provide that 24/7 power. So I think the key is bridging that gap, the cost gap, right, for new technologies and what's there. And so you can do that with tax incentives. You can do that in finding ways to facilitate pooling risk, as Michelle laid out. You could do it with advanced market commitments. And I think that's going to be a really key piece of the puzzle. We're seeing not just Google, and really kudos to Google for their big push on 24/7 and really putting money where their mouth is. But we're seeing big, industrial users, the Nucors, the big steel developers, the US Steels, chemical producers say, hey, we need a steady supply of these things. How do we pool the risk for the early deployments, bring out, enhanced geothermal technologies, things like that, and allow us to not just have project one, because, over the last 5 years, we've seen big technology push policies, right? The supply side, like cost shares and tax incentives. How do we make it so that we're giving customers confidence in pooling some of the risk of a project 2, 3, 4, 5 moving forward? Right. And so I think there's a lot of different ways to do that.
Right. Well, the audience is not disappointed, and we have some great questions already. So, Jeremy, I'm going to pose this first one to you. Are there successful examples of demand pull mechanisms working in the clean energy context the panel can point to overseas? And I'm wondering if you can talk about the UK contract for difference model, which I think is really clever.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it's getting to that crux of that issue of how do you bridge the gap on the cost today for these new innovative technologies to allow for the original commercial deployments and ultimately allow us to scale project 2, 3, 4, 5. So in the UK, they're basically providing a financial incentive to bridge that financial gap. They set a baseline of what's already out there in the market, but then are providing a financial incentive to kind of fill that cost gap and really drive the customer, de-risk for the customer, the ability to procure these resources. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. In fact, I think the DOE is looking to mimic a lot of this in some cases. For example, in their hydrogen push, both the hydrogen hubs proposal coming out of DOE and a recent request for information has come out. They're trying to find different ways, and hydrogen may be a good example where this contract for differences concept may make a lot of sense. We could see that in a power circumstance. I would say the only other one thing I'd put out there is the government as a buyer is important as well too, and we've seen that both in the UK and Europe, but also in the US for low carbon materials, for low carbon power. The Air Force wanting to buy 24/7 power, that could be an important tool as well.
So Rachel, did you want to jump in on this? And
Yeah,
then I have a
just to-
question from the audience as well.
Okay, just on the contract for difference, I think it's a really interesting model. I think the nice thing about it is people are bidding, competing on that, how much subsidy they need to be able to deliver the wind power in the UK case. The one challenge you have is, because these things take a long time, is if somebody wins the bid and then it doesn't go well, and then you're kind of, are they going to ask for going to ask for more money? There's a classic thing in auctions that the people who win auctions may have kind of underbid or overbid if they're buying. And so I think contract for difference is really interesting in getting that competition going, but I think it probably needs to be adapted a bit for things like hydrogen, but I mean, this is the kind of work we need to get into.
Right. So Rachel, your comment about trying to avoid a situation where you're having to pick winners resonated with the audience. And one question that they had for you is, what are some different ways in which the government can actually do that? So what are some ways that you've seen of the government, being able to embrace that principle of, technological neutrality, or, not prematurely choosing just one firm to support?
Exactly. So this pneumococcal advanced market commitment that I talked about was open to anyone who could come up with a pneumococcal vaccine. It was actually interesting. It was a legally binding commitment that the donors put on themselves, but was not a contract with any individual firm. It was a legally binding commitment for a market to buy something that passed the criteria that were set. So people sometimes think that a legally binding commitment has to be with an individual firm, but it doesn't have to be. So that we kind of proved the case in that case. If you think about it, an R&D tax credit is also, agnostic by firm. It's, whoever works on R&D, but that's paying for inputs. It's not paying for outputs. So what you want to do is do both, pay for an output and be agnostic.
Right. So, go ahead.
If I could add one example that we're seeing this in the US government now is on carbon dioxide removal. So the DOE recently announced this procurement program, and effectively they're structuring it as an RFP that is a low cost bidder standpoint, right? So they're neutral on the removal solution as a whole. It goes to the technology development or solution developer to say, hey, I can deliver this carbon abatement at this price. I think that is a structure that could be used both private sector and government wide.
Right. So Michelle, one question is whether you could talk a little bit more about how you might see using demand aggregation from multiple companies of addressing this challenge that we see with a sort of first of a kind or first N of a kind.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, one of the tricky pieces about doing this with electricity is obviously electricity is very localized. And so matching up supply and demand, so making sure that the projects are sited where, the buyers have load, it is going to be, a more complex process than it might be for something like carbon removals, right, which is fungible. And so I think there's a thoughtfulness, right, for how you bring all of this together. I think, as Rachel and Jeremy were saying, when you do select for the projects, I think selecting for it by way of technology criteria, right? So a couple principles like, below certain life cycle emissions or ability to reach certain levels of scale or additionality, in addition to cost, is a great way to make sure that we're finding the right projects. And then when it comes to bringing together the buyer cohort, I think it's about, pulling together demand by region. So, you can think in the US it by, RTO. So, by MISO or SPP or PJM, and really trying to find projects that regionally work for the subset of buyers, and then coming together to really do that contracting in unison, right? So how can we strike a set of terms that work across the entire buyer set, but still gives that project enough revenue confidence in order to get that project built and financed.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything that you've learned either from both Frontier or the Clean Energy Buyers Association about how to do that well?
Yeah, I think, like I said, sending sort of that technology principle, so not selecting winners, is definitely a key takeaway that we've learned. I think the second is just really being hyper focused on making sure that that offtake contract works for the buyers, which is, an undertaking in and of itself to get, a lot of different corporates with different procurement processes and budgets and guardrails aligned on what offtake contract works for them. But ultimately that it works for the suppliers as well, right? So we want to make sure that these offtake contracts are long enough, that they sort of have the tenor that's required, that they have maybe, the flexibilities on, things like cost overruns or delays or, provisions around guarantees that, maybe have been worked out pretty clearly for wind and solar, and there's sort of a playbook for how to do it. I think when it comes to things like geothermal, we're going to have to write that playbook a little bit as we go and define that offtake contract in a way that offers a little bit of wiggle room, especially for those first of a kind projects, because a lot of these first projects will have a lot of unknown unknowns, and we need to make sure that that offtake contract is flexible enough to accommodate those unknowns, to allow that project to ultimately get across the finish line.
Got it. So Rachel, we had a question about, we've been talking about government efforts, like government saying we'll buy vaccines, and then we've been talking about private sector efforts, with companies like Google, stepping up and saying, hey, we're willing to pay a premium for advanced clean energy technologies to, get them economies of scale and help them drive down the learning curve. But interestingly, Germany has a model that has both government involvement and private sector involvement. So could you say anything about the ideas that they're experimenting with?
Okay, so I don't know so much about I don't know exactly the example that you're thinking about in Germany. I would say like the pneumococcal one was actually foundations and governments.
Mm-hmm.
Was that example. I think everyone in carbon removal thinks that it's very important that both private sector and government get involved.
Right.
The frontier piece at the moment is funded by private sector groups are funding this advanced market commitment for carbon removal. But I think everyone recognizes that eventually the amounts of carbon removal that we'll need will almost certainly involve government.
Right.
And, indeed
the
US
private sector is not going to be able to buy 10 gigatons
No.
of permanent carbon removal.
And both the US and German government are looking at purchasing carbon removal. So I think one thing that's really important there is that we have some agreement about what does carbon removal mean across these different initiatives. And obviously Frontier has set one set of standards, but you might want to also have some carbon removal that's not quite as permanent or as long-term as Frontier is doing. So, but I think there's this important role of often the private sector getting out there first and experimenting, but you often need the government to come in and do a lot of purchases or do regulations. Once the private sector has shown that something's possible, often then the government can come in and do regulations saying you have to do this once we know that it's possible. So I think that's the kind of combination of setting standards and common standards across, relying on government money, often
Right.
private sector, and being involved in experimenting at the early stages.
Great. So Jeremy, we've got two questions for you. One is there a role for state government? We've been talking a lot about the federal government, but as Michelle reminded us, there's a very important regional dimension to energy markets. What role do you think states could play in this area? And maybe talk about geothermal in general, not just market shaping.
Yeah, absolutely. I think can play a really important role, particularly in regulated markets and in wholesale electricity markets. States can provide some incentives based off what they particularly need. Right, we've seen that in particular the Midwest. In the case of where they wanted to value the clean, firm power from nuclear power plants, for example, we've seen states to do implement market shaping policies, and I think a lot could be done on that front as well. In the end, it's valuing 24/7 power as a whole, and I feel as an advocate for geothermal and other technology space, geothermal has an upper hand in putting in a low cost bid to provide that in the near term. In particular, I do think states need to unlock the ability to scale more quickly, and so the permitting stuff in particular is just important at the state and local level as it is on the federal side. So I think it's multiple fold or twofold, both on incentives, valuing the need, especially in states that are demanding it for industrial competitiveness, for example, or data centers or other clear demand needs for 24/7 power, and then really unlocking the ability to commercially scale this up quickly.
And what evidence do we have that policymakers in both the executive branch and the Congress are thinking about these ideas?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I mentioned a little bit on the Department of Energy side, a big push both from the program offices and the technology areas. I mentioned the hydrogen RFI, for example, and trying to find ways to drive the demand push on that side. The Loan Program Office and the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, likewise, is looking to do more to de-risk. In the end, that's what we're doing here, is de-risking some of these new innovative technologies. And even on the tax side, we saw Congress commit to a variety of incentives and policies, both in the bipartisan infrastructure bill and in the tax package last year, that really was trying to push the buyers, the consumers, to prioritize this 24/7 power.
Got it. Michelle, got a question for Google, which is that there's an enormous opportunity to repurpose technologies that have been developed by the oil and gas sector to help lower the cost of geothermal. How would Google think about collaborating with the oil and gas sector on the development of geothermal?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. And, we think that all of these technologies are going to be so critical that we don't want to leave any stakeholders off the table. And so I think there's so much that we can learn from the fossil fuel industry and oil and gas players who are increasingly coming into geothermal and lending a lot of their expertise when it comes to subsurface and mapping and drilling. And so I think there's a lot of knowledge transfer that is yet to be done. And when you think about the role that Google can play, we would love to have a role in a lot of, for example, that subsurface work, right? And so thinking through the role that, our AI and ML capabilities can lend to sorting through a lot of the data that geothermal drillers have to sort through, right, when they're trying to develop their projects. And so I think that's one creative way that we can partner. And then ultimately, like I said, I think we're going to need creative financing in order to make these projects work. So if Google is able to come bring the offtake, other sort of players who are able to come in and sort of fill in the remainder of that capital stack, I think are going to be really important as well. So long story short, I think we'll need all hands on deck.
Yeah, can I just add on that? Because I think it's really important on the financing side. I think I mentioned that one of the issues that you have on market shaping, if you're paying for the end product, is that there's financing through the process if people know that there's a buyer at the end of it. And so it's really important not to exclude companies that actually have financing that could help finance these alternative projects, and also encourage them to see financial opportunities that they can divert from investments that are less good for the world to investments that are more good for the world. So I think it's really important that we include them, and there's a real opportunity here.
So, Rachel, one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is milestone payments. So there was a very successful collaboration between NASA and SpaceX, where NASA said, we had retired the space shuttle, and so we had to give the Russians $50 million per astronaut per ticket to get them to the International Space Station. So NASA said to SpaceX, if you can develop a rocket that can go to the International Space Station and deliver and retrieve cargo and ultimately crew, not only will we buy rides on the rocket, but we will provide you with firm fixed price milestone payments for intermediate progress towards that goal. And that's what allowed SpaceX to finance the development of the Falcon 9. How do you think about when you might want to use a milestone payment approach? So for example, if we were thinking about advanced geothermal and really, drilling much deeper than we have to date, and demonstrating new technologies that can really help us with that, might there be a value in milestone payments, particularly if you've got startups that, unlike the case of Pfizer in your pneumococcal story, Pfizer could self-finance once they knew the demand was there, and startups may not always have that. So how do you think about the role that milestone payments can play?
So milestone payments are really important in different situations. They have one drawback, which I'll talk about, but they are particularly important and useful when you have an intermediate technology that maybe lots of different firms could benefit from. Mm-hmm. So, something about drilling or something about mapping that lots of people could benefit from. And if other people could copy that, if they see you making progress and they can copy it, that's going to be really underinvested in. So you really want to reward that intermediate technology with a milestone payment or even a prize or an AMC on itself, so that then all the other competing groups can use it. You do have to then pick. You can't be completely technology agnostic when you do that. You have to say, this is something that I think is really important for lots of different users, and we're going to put a prize or an AMC on that intermediate, or a milestone payment on that intermediate point. So you lose a little bit of this technology agnostic, but I think there are a lot of cases when that's really important to do.
Right. So we have about a minute and a half remaining, and Jeremy, I'm wondering if you can give a sort of a quick response to the following question, which is, what opportunities do you see to get Congress more excited about these ideas?
Yeah, I think that the moment is now, right? As a result of the big policy that was getting done over the last 4 years that was on the technology push side, the desire to see that come to fruition and really yield is now. And so how do we maximize the impact of those things? So I think hitting some initial milestones, private sector showing that those early technology push policies are effective will only drive more interest in folks wanting to see projects 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then really engaging at the local level, I think is a really important piece of the puzzle, because as Michelle underscored, markets are local. We're talking about electricity in particular. Local dynamics are important, and so seeing ways that, like at the local level, and how local level policies can complement the federal incentives is important.
Fantastic. Well, I've really learned a lot from this conversation. I hope you have too. And I think there's an exciting opportunity here, and we need to get the geothermal sector and investors and large corporate purchasers and policymakers on the same page on these ideas so we can take advantage of the heat beneath our feet. Thank you all very much.